So with regard to the discussion at hand, I would just say this much, that at this point, I would like us to start taking, paying closer attention to the sources that historians are using and the ways that they're interpreting those sources. When we had the workshop with Professor Seaman, one of the examples he gave in terms of methodologies or approaches for historians is whether scholars are using a top-down approach, a bottom-up approach. This week we have a similar set of readings in terms of sources. Across board, the four historians we're looking at are using sources generated from the actions, debates, medical journals, and travel literature of the master class. But they are all writing different types of histories. Okay, I'll turn it over to you. Cassandra.
So the first thing that I have is I created a document that is kind of like a guide for the group discussion. With these questions, I will ask and start to enter into this question of top-down, bottom-up methodology, but these are some generalized questions. So let's do this. And the first thing I would like to do is try to use the introduction of women and slavery as an introduction to the conversation as a whole, if that makes sense. Because one of the things, at least that I noted, is that Campbell's, Myers, and Miller are making a claim here in this intro, and making a claim about like then what the purpose of this whole book is, which is that slavery studies have overwhelmingly focused on males, and that focus is due in part to hyper-awareness of the Atlantic slave trade. It doesn't take into account other systems of slavery that are overwhelmingly feminine in nature, meaning feminine in trade. And so that is the thing to think about, and how do we start to get at this narrative or these stories that have been largely, by the editors of this book, rendered invisible. So the first question, just to kind of get us warmed up, that I'll throw out is, so what does it mean to be a woman and a slave when your reality through the terms of slavery as a system is thought about as men trading men? What does that mean? How does that affect the narrative?
You're emphasizing the male-centeredness of both the subject matter, but also the sources.
Yes. There's a male-centeredness in the sources. One of the things you will note here is a lot of times this is coming from master's point of view, and there's a reason why they're masters, not mistresses. Like, it's often talking about the trade of men, and yet we have this whole class of women who are being traded, who are theoretically part of the master class. So then what does it mean when that narrative is rendered invisible? And then how do we start to address that as historians?
Macy, do you want to start?
What makes you think that I want to start?
From the historiography.
Sure. I think that part of what happens is that we have to reconceive like slavery, right? We have to think of it in different terms, because we think about it in solely patriarchal terms, then we just continue that exclusion of women from the narrative of what it means to be enslaved. And we also miss a more, I think your word is capacious definition of slavery that would encompass other forms of dependency, right? That could extend all the way to that master class. I think, I forget the name of the article, but the reading that focused on that like Republican notion of French Revolution, like really emphasized the way that even once the sort of like feudal patriarchal notion was overturned in the French Revolution, then it was still replaced with a Republican notion in which women only access society through their relationship to men, right? So that's still a level of dependency, even if it's not slavery. And if we rethink the ways that we define slavery, then we can see more levels of dependency. We can see a greater like wealth that has been ignored that's completely missed.
And also it forces us to more clearly look at various levels of societies themselves, whether that is at the micro level, at the family level, to the levels within the community, to the island of Martinique, for example, or Saint-Dome, to France itself. All the way through, there are dependencies and interdependencies, and those pressures back and forth. Not all the slaveholders had agency completely either. They had to answer to other powers, and with the French government constantly shifting and changing, then the rules of the game were shifted and changing, and therefore finally the gender relations changed too. Because now, whether you're a man or a woman, you got to set plans differently yet again.
Yeah, let's stick with the
But
particular
it is the
example
biggest
from-
thing.
yeah.
But it is at the family level. It is the most profound.
Yeah, so let's stick with those two examples from Sue Peabody's article. So how do the example of the three sisters exemplify the point that Macy and Justin are making? Remember the three sisters?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
They were Mary Cassello, Caitlin Lemmy, and Bette Bitcher.
Venture, yes.
And they ran a tavern and inn in Saint Pierre, Martinique,
Mhm.
in the first decade of the 18th century.
And so Mary Castellet and Lemmy already gained admission, but Bincher didn't. And the sitting governor denied her application, and for her temerity, sentenced her to jail. A new governor came in, her sisters reappealed, and she was released. How does Peabody define the relationship between this new governor who released Bincher and the three sisters? How did the three sisters gain access to this new governor?
Take that over. Well, there's how Peabody described it, and there's also how the society and his enemies later described it. Because these women were successful, so even though they were slaves, they had money, right? They owned a tavern. That was a big deal. And that meant that they could utilize that to access him and start to appeal to him. So start to think about, what does that mean for feminine power in the system?
So what kind of slavery existed in Martinique that would enable three female slaves to accumulate sufficient capital to own a tavern, to give probably expensive gifts to the wife of the governor, to have an audience with him behind closed doors, such that when they came out, there were murmurs of scandal from the waiting senior French officials outside who had to wait 3 or 4 hours before they could see this governor. So what was slavery like in Martinique that enabled a class of semi-autonomous slave women to generate wealth, own small businesses, and exercise a political agency?
I think Peabody emphasizes that it was wage-based, right? That as long as you paid like a certain wage or tax to your owner, then you were largely autonomous, right? You could manage your own affairs to a certain extent, even if legally at any point you were very vulnerable. She makes Peabody's, she makes the point that the wealth from that tavern could have been seized by the owning family at any point. But the fact that they didn't shows that there's a certain social expectation of that not happening, that there would be some kind of economic or social ramification to doing so.
And in that particular context, right, I mean, you can think of it as a form of accommodation, mutual accommodation, because it was in the interest of slave owners to allow that small degree of autonomy to their enslaved women, because that would enable them to not classify them as property, and by not classifying them as property, as slaves, they would not pay the heavy taxes that had been imposed on that property by the French government. And so you have masters trying to evade the state surveillance and thereby availing greater freedom to their slaves, and slaves capitalizing on this to push the boundary of freedom, so to speak, and to initiate self-purchase. What was the percentile rise in self-manumission in the French Caribbean populous island of Martinique at the turn of the 18th century?
7 to 33%.
7 to 33%. That is significant. And of these 33, the proportion of slaves that gained freedom through self-purchase, this 33% at the turn of the 18th century, what proportion were women, generally speaking? Majority. Mm-hmm. Okay, so how was slave emancipation gendered then? How did male slaves gain manumission in this context?
The other way would be you could, as a male, gain it through your mother, though, as well. Mm-hmm. So that was a gendered on multiple levels aspect that should be considered. Because like there's a reason why women were the minority, or the majority, gaining their freedom in this way. Do you remember how that was working?
As far as having children with free white men, and then essentially by doing that, being able to capitalize on their children, especially if they were baptized. And I'm not sure how, I sort of lost track later in this period, but there were laws still around requiring that the free male had to marry the female.
Code noir.
Yeah.
And masters were reclassifying some of these brown descendants as free in the baptismal records so that they wouldn't pay taxes on them. Right?
So they wouldn't pay taxes, and also on a couple occasions so that they would have heirs. Because also the part of this would be another question. So part of the reason why we see, at least in America, these slave systems as men trading men is because women were oftentimes the minority numbers. But how does that benefit? Because Peabody is partially making an argument that because we're so focused on masculinity, that we forget that emancipation didn't actually benefit emancipated women on the same level. And also on a side making an argument that there were ways in which the system of slavery could allow women to find emancipation at larger rates than blanket freedom. So how does things like the numbers of women who are available and around affect this? Like starting to think about the evidence.
Well, if men vastly outnumber women and there aren't enough like European descent women to marry all of the colonizing men, then inevitably you're going to start seeing interracial marriage, right? Like that's going to be a consequence of the demographic. Partially to produce heirs, so you have someone to pass all this wealth you're producing down to, but also because humans are humans and they get lonely.
Because we talked about the three sisters, could we start to bring in, if it's okay, the example of Marie Victoria into this conversation? Y'all remember? Who remembers what was going on there? Someone give me a summary. So I'm tired of talking.
She attempted to have her status revoked. She was more or less imprisoned. 3 separate times she runs away. She has a notarization, but it's not accepted by the French court. And it actually, goes up the chain beyond just a colonial matter to the royal court. It's a success story, but at the same time, it just indicates how white colonial authority could still reinforce slavery.
Because there's a little bit to the beginning of that. I'm not going to pronounce this name correctly. Senior, who speaks French? What's this word?
I don't know.
Okay, anyway.
Moreau,
I took Spanish, so.
Makes them useless. Essentially, original master dies, says that several slaves can inherit the plantation. There's about 7 of them. The 4 males just get to leave. And she, his original master's brother says, well, each one has to prove that they are sufficiently humble, sufficiently understanding of, who they are in their place as people of color. The 4 males get away. She somehow angers this guy, and that's partially what creates this legal battle. Is each time she's not humbled, but she still wants her freedom, and he's constantly trying to humble her. So it is this back and forth of not just, oh, it just happened, but like there's some personal interactions between her and a particular slave owner that's driving this. So that's partially when I say, let's bring that in there. What are some of the factors driving this? What are some of the factors that each side is using in order to negotiate this pull and push? Oh, that makes sense.
And the allusion to sex, which nobody seems to have picked up on, was from a reading last week, and I guess in the past 2 weeks. One of the arguments that Campbell, Myers, and Miller make is that sex has a history, and that under slavery, that sex mattered. It's a topic that historians are squeamish to talk about or write about, but it's one that's central to understanding the experiences of enslaved women, especially in the Caribbean, or even in British North America, where, as we saw, the slavery systems were distinctive in the prevalence of natural reproduction, which enabled the expansive growth of the internal slave trade. So, if sex has a history and the enslaved women's experiences predicated on a conflation of racial, gender, identity, what do we miss when we don't focus on women in slavery studies? What do we miss? The history of Atlantic slavery in the Americas. What do we miss when we don't focus on women? Yes?
Yeah, well, I'd say just generally, we miss like a lot of the kind of subtleties and complexities of relationships between, both slaves, slave and master, and even, if we're talking about gender in, kind of a broader sense, I think master and master too. And I think a lot of those kind of ways of control, a lot of those ways in which people are pushed to do certain things, I think that's very gendered in a lot of cases. And I think something like the example here that we were talking about, I think that really shows that, that gender did have a big role to play in sort of the power dynamic. And if you don't take that into account, you're missing a lot of the motivation behind actions in the study.
And Stephen, and then Dustin.
Well, one of the things, and this is sort of skipping ahead to the Orwell reading, if I may do that too.
Yes, ma'am.
But it's that the whole idea that slavery was a negotiated relationship in a way. Male slaves and female slaves negotiated differently with it and often had different results, where if you're trying to look at slavery as a whole and look at those relationships that shape the interactions, shape the overall shape of slavery in the Americas, you're missing one completely different method or completely different facet of the negotiation process, and ultimately a huge part of the outcome. So.
And very briefly, it also changes, in a sense, the value system, the value of the person, that individual person, in the mind of that master or whoever's being affected by such behavior. Her worth is altered by that relationship.
her worth is 100% altered by this relationship, because one of the differences between her and the three sisters is they are very clear to say that she is mulatto. Which that means something significant, right? She is either the daughter or maybe even a lover, hopefully not both, of this previous master, which means this brother comes in, so it's not just that this pull is about labor, but it's about sexual labor as well. And part of why I asked this is then could we tie maybe her struggles to the pull and push of sexual relationships and relationships, even though legally they keep trying to skirt it and say it's just that she's disrespectful. Is it that she's disrespectful, or is it that she's trying to escape a sexual power on top of a labor power that this man is trying to hold over her?